I wanted to start out today by showing you an image of this facility. This facility was very much in the news in the 90s, early 90s in particular. Does anybody recognize what this facility is? Biosphere 2, exactly. Very good. Biosphere 2 was a facility that was built in the early 90s. It currently is still there today, and you could go and visit. It was just built outside of Tucson, Arizona, and they run tours where you can go and visit and see what's going on there. But what's going on there today is very different from what it was originally intended to do. Has anybody actually been there to tour the facility? Yeah, okay. So I'm glad to see some people are familiar with this. So originally, what the original intention of Biosphere 2 was to create this self-contained, self-sustaining series of ecosystems to support a crew of 8 people for a period of several years, in this case, 2 years. So they built a series of ecosystems, rainforest, an ocean, desert ecosystem, and of course an agricultural production area in order to sustain the crew of 8 people that were going to live there. But the idea was to create a self-supporting system that would support a crew of 8 people without bringing in any outside resources from outside the facility, and just live on the resources within the facility. Well, things began to go wrong almost from day one once they enclosed the facility. What was observed almost immediately was a very precipitous increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and a very sharp decrease in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Now, the crew of 8 people were going to try and live under that altered atmosphere for as long as they could, but it became clear that the crew of 8 were beginning to show symptoms as a result of these altered atmospheric conditions, and that in the interest of safety and the health of the individuals inside, they eventually had to bring in oxygen from without the system. So that kind of violated the first principle of Biosphere 2. Eventually they had to bring in water, and eventually they had to bring in food as well. So Biosphere 2, unfortunately, was largely unsuccessful in creating a self-supporting, self-sustaining series of the ecosystems within this enclosed facility. Well, what went wrong in Biosphere 2? What it came down to was a failure to account for the living soil, a failure to account for just the sheer amount of biological activity that was consuming vast amounts of oxygen and producing vast amounts of carbon dioxide. And those levels of carbon dioxide obviously were in excess of plants' ability to absorb those levels of carbon dioxide during the process of photosynthesis. So that failure of Biosphere 2 was largely a failure to understand the living soil and the soil food web. So what are some of the take-home lessons from Biosphere 2? Obviously, one of the first lessons were that how critical the soil food web is into sustaining life within this created ecosystem, but on sustaining life on our planet as well. For without it, life would come to a grinding halt. But the other lesson learned from Biosphere 2 was best stated by the physicist Richard Feynman, who said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." Well, he was talking about physics at the time that he made that statement, but it could well apply to what happened in Biosphere 2 as well, because it really was a failure to understand some of the fundamental biological properties of the living soil. Now, when you think about it, this is not an isolated example, because we've created in this country and many other countries an industrial agricultural system that's very much dependent on inputs from outside the agricultural system. These are inputs: fertilizer, pesticide, herbicide, which in many cases are very expensive, and in some cases are very destructive to the biological properties of the soil. And so this has led to many scientists and many growers asking the question, with a better understanding of the soil food web, can we be less reliant on a lot of these outside inputs? And a lot of work is being going on right now under the title of regenerative agriculture that is trying to do that, develop agricultural systems with a better understanding of the soil food web and becoming less reliant on some of these outside inputs. So today, I want to talk about some of the basic elements of the soil food web. What are some of the major groups of organisms within the soil food web? What are all these organisms doing in the soil? What are their ecological functions? Of course, there are a number of important interactions that are occurring in the soil to help sustain and create a healthy soil environment that I'm going to talk more about today, and just some keys to sustaining healthy soil food webs. So what is the soil food web? The soil food web is a community of interacting organisms that facilitate the transfer of energy and nutrients through the soil ecosystem. It's a process that begins with photosynthesis and the growing of plant biomass that then becomes food for a whole community of microorganisms that then become food for a whole community of invertebrates, which become food for other larger invertebrates, which eventually become food for birds and mammals as well. So some of the key elements of this, of course, is that transfer of energy and nutrients by an staggering diversity of organisms that exist in the soil. No one knows how many species there are in the soil, just staggering numbers. And of course, the complexity of interactions, of course, that occurs is a very characteristic element of all food webs. And of course, during this whole process, there's a feedback mechanism where the nutrients that are contained in dead organic matter are released through the processing and transfer of energy into the soil, and then released into the soil that are made available into the roots of plants that are made available for plant growth and reproduction. And it's all occurring largely hidden to our view. It's kind of an invisible world, an incredibly dynamic but invisible world that occurs beneath our feet. So what are these groups of organisms? What are they doing in the soil? How are they earning a living? How do they derive their sources of energy in order to survive? Well, one of the most important groups are the decomposers, and they're feeding on dead organic matter. And then some of them, some of the organisms of the soil are actually conducting photosynthesis. It's not only plants that are able to conduct photosynthesis, some of the microorganisms are able to do so as well. Then there are important symbiotic associations that occur. I'm going to talk more about that later in the lecture. Then there are herbivores that feed on living plant biomass, both above ground and below ground. And then there are predators that feed on living organisms. And then, of course, there are a number of important plant pathogens and pests as well, but unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to talk about the pathogens today. Now, the first time I saw the results of this study, I was really taken aback by how dominant the decomposer community is. This was a study, was part of a much larger study called the International Biomes Study that was conducted in the 70s and was funded by the National Science Foundation. And the result of this study are from a particular forest, a deciduous forest, I believe it was in Georgia at the time, where it showed that as much as 95% of the energy created through plant growth goes to the decomposer community. And only 5% went to herbivores. Now, there have been subsequent studies from this earlier study that show it's roughly, for most forest ecosystems, in the range of about 85 to 95% of the energy going to the decomposer community. Other ecosystems like savannas and grasslands, the ratio is more like 60 and 40, but the take-home lesson here is the decomposer community is the dominant community of organisms in the soil food web. And of course, there are biological reasons for this. Plants are known to have an immune system. They produce a number of different compounds that are toxic to herbivores and deter many organisms from feeding upon them. And it's only a smaller group of organisms or herbivores that are able to overcome the defense system of plants that allow them to feed directly on plant biomass. Now, of the 95% that goes to the decomposing community, which is made up of microbes and invertebrates, 90% of that energy goes to microbial organisms and only 10% to invertebrates. And there are biological reasons for this as well. Now, when I use the term energy, I'm using it synonymously with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the currency of energy in the soil ecosystem, as they are in most ecosystems. And it is microbes that have the kinds of enzymatic machinery that are able to break down the more complex carbohydrates. Plants produce simple carbohydrates in the way of simple starches and sugars, and more complex carbohydrates such as cellulose and lignin, which are difficult for organisms to digest and utilize as an energy source. But it's the microbes that really have the enzymatic capacity to break down those complex carbohydrates and why they're so dominant in the soil community in terms of energy consumption. Now, invertebrates have a much more poor assimilation efficiency in terms of consuming dead organic matter. But as it turns out, they have much more important roles in the decomposition process than the 10% of energy consumption that they consume. In ecology, they're referred to as ecosystem regulators, and I'm going to talk more about that, what that exactly means and what kind of roles the invertebrates play. Now, these are the major groups of microbial organisms. All these organisms can be found to one degree or another in the soil. It's important to keep in mind with microbes, as it is with invertebrates, when you move from one ecosystem to another, the composition of soil communities changes very dramatically. And that's certainly true of microbes as well. And many of these are more characteristic, like green algae, protozoa, and the archaea in different types of ecosystems. Some do well in extreme environments or very wet environments. But the bacteria and fungi are the dominant microbial organisms in terrestrial ecosystems. So I'm going to confine my talk today, in the interest of time, to those two groups. Now, bacteria are simple single-celled organisms. For those of you who remember from biology class, the prokaryotic organisms, they have no membrane-bound nucleus. They're incredibly small, often difficult to see even under high magnification, and they occur with huge abundance, as much as a billion or over a billion per teaspoon of soil have been reported in some soils. Now, as indicated, they to some degree are able to produce the kinds of enzymes that are necessary to break down those complex carbohydrates, so they are very important in decomposition. They tend to concentrate around the root system of plants, but one of the characteristics of a lot of bacteria is they're very pH intolerant. And for that reason, they don't do well in the more acidic soils of particularly in forest communities, forest ecosystems. That's particularly so of conifer soils in the Pacific Northwest that tends to be have a lower pH than most forest ecosystems. Again, no one has any idea how many species of bacteria there are. There are estimates of well over 1 billion species, but no one really knows. And the truth is that when you look into scientific reviews of bacteria, there's a lot of arguments as to what a species even is. How do you even define a species in terms of bacteria? Nevertheless, It has been determined that the bacteria perform a number of important functions in the soil. They're important decomposers in most ecosystems. Now, decomposition is the breakdown of dead organic matter into its inorganic constituent parts. A lot of these constituent parts are nutrients that plants need for continued growth and reproduction. But as these nutrients are released, they're often in forms that plants can absorb. So these inorganic molecules go through a number of transformations before they can become absorbed by the roots of plants for plant growth. And a lot of those transformations are performed by the bacteria. So they're incredibly important in the nutrient cycles in the soil as well. There are a number of synthetic organisms as well, which I don't have time to talk about today. Really fundamental role that they play is in nitrogen fixation, and I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes, as well as symbiotic associations that occur in the soil as well. They're very important biological control agents. When I was pest program manager with the State Department of Agriculture, we routinely used the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, or BTK, as a means of eradicating gypsy moth populations whenever they were introduced into the state. Gypsy moths have now been renamed spongy moth. But in any case, it was a very effective means of eradicating gypsy moth populations once they were introduced into the state. And it was a really great way to avoid or go around using chemical pesticides, which most people were adverse to. Bacteria are very important in long-term formation of the soil in terms of soil sequestration and the stabilizing of nutrients in the soil, a long-term process of soil formation, and there are a number of plant pathogens that are important. Bacteria's pathogens as well. Oops. Just want to show you this slide that compares the size scale of fungi with bacteria. These elongated shapes in the center of this electron microscope slide shows the fungal hyphae. Fungal hyphae are microscopic in size in and of themselves. You do need a microscope and high magnification in order to see fungal hyphae. Bacteria, as you can see, these smaller spherical shapes along the length of the hyphae are the bacteria. And you can see they're very much smaller than the fungal hyphae themselves. But as what's characteristic of bacteria, they occur in incredible abundance as well. Now, one of the incredibly important interactions that occur in the soil is biological nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the transformation of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia and eventually ammonium, which is the form that plants can absorb through their plant roots. There's both symbiotic nitrogen fixation and free-living nitrogen fixation, but by far the symbiotic nitrogen fixation is the most important type of nitrogen fixation occurring in the soil. In fact, for most terrestrial ecosystems, not all necessarily, but most terrestrial ecosystems, nitrogen fixation, this biological nitrogen fixation, is the primary source of nitrogen in most terrestrial ecosystems. Now, in this association, the bacteria attach themselves to the root system of plants and supply the plant with a very much needed nutrient for growth as nitrogen, and many ecosystems are nitrogen limited. And the tree in return supplies the bacteria with simple starches and sugars that it utilizes as an energy source. Now that side on the left is red alder root, which is the most important nitrogen fixing plant in forest communities in the Pacific Northwest. And nitrogen fixation occurs in these root nodules that form on the root system of nitrogen-fixing plants. It's estimated that about 10% of plant species are nitrogen-fixing species of plants. And there are many other species as well, lupinus, clover, and ceanothus that are probably well known to you. But it's particularly important to in the Pacific Northwest, where it's estimated that as much as 70% of the forests in the Pacific Northwest are nitrogen limited. And when I say nitrogen limited, I mean that plants respond with the addition of nitrogen with increased plant growth. Even though they may not be showing symptoms of deficiency, they nevertheless respond with increased plant growth as a result of this additional nitrogen. And it's not just the nitrogen-fixing species that are responding. All the plants in the community, even many non-fixation plants, are also responding to this increased introduction of nitrogen with increased growth and reproduction. So the next group is fungi, and fungi are, again, very unique in their ability to decompose organic matter. Even have a greater capacity than bacteria in decomposing these complex carbohydrates such as cellulose and lignin, which makes them the dominant organisms that are decomposing woody biomass in forests. And many of you walking through the forest have seen cubical brown rot in decaying logs, which is brown rot fungi decaying the woody biomass. That occurs predominantly on conifer logs. In deciduous logs, you may see this white spongy rot occurring in the log, which is, again, a response to fungal decay. There are a number of symbiotic associations, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. And of course, there's some devastating fungal plant pathogens as well. There are some patches of forest that are incredibly dense with fungal hyphae. As much as 200 meters of hyphae have been recorded in a single teaspoon of soil. But the distribution of mycelium and hyphae are very patchy and unevenly distributed. Excuse me. Now, of course, many of us are familiar with the sporocarp. That's the spore-producing structure of the fungi. But it's the below-ground structure that's responsible for decomposition, the mycelium and the hyphae. Now, mycelium are these root-like structures that occur at great distances in the soil, below ground, where decomposition is occurring. Mycelium are macroscopic. That's to say you can see them. If you peel back the litter layer in the soil, you'll see these cottony thread-like structures in the soil. That are the mycelium. They're kind of grayish and whitish in color. Now, the mycelium are composed of the microstructure, or the hyphae, which is the microscopic portion of the fungus. Now, the hyphae release enzymes externally to its cell wall. So the digestion process and the breakdown of dead organic matter occurs externally to the cell, where decomposition occurs and then gets reabsorbed through the cell wall. I have to, let's see. Whoops. I want to, there was this study, I have to share this with you. I just stumbled across this study that through genetic analysis, they did this study of a particular genotype of a disease-causing fungus called armillaria that was done in a forest in Oregon, and found that this one particular genotype covered some 2,385 acres of forest in Oregon, which gave it the title of the largest living organism on the planet. Well, that's unusual. Not all species of fungi are able to have that extent of fungal hyphae. So the other important association that occurs in the soil, very fundamental and very critical to the health of the soil, is mycorrhizae symbiosis. And mycorrhizae symbiosis is the association of the fungus with the roots of plants. Now, in this association, the fungus forms a sheath around the root system of the plants, and in some types actually grows in the internal tissue of the root system. And in that process, transfers energy, not so much energy, but nutrients and water to the root system of the plants. Fungi are also known to produce a number of antibiotic compounds that are deterrents to other microbial organisms that might otherwise cause diseases in the plant. So it's thought to be protective of the plant against root-diseasing microorganisms. In return, the tree supplies starches, simple starches, and sugars to the fungus. It's a very wide spread association in the natural world, where as much as 90% of the plants have mycorrhizal associates of one kind or another. And a single individual plant could literally have dozens and dozens of different species of mycorrhizae associated with its root system. This slide, there's two images on the left show seedlings growing with and without mycorrhizal fungi, and you can see the much more enhanced plant growth that occurs in the presence of mycorrhizae. And if you look at the photo on the right-hand side, you could get a sense of why that occurs. In a sense, the mycelium network that extends throughout the soil and in a sense extends the root system of the plant, and the plant is able to mine the soil to a much greater extent and a much greater volume of soil for both energy and water, resulting in the increased growth of the plants. And we're talking about nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and many others. So the next group that are a very important part of the soil food web are the soil invertebrates. Now, as I indicated earlier, they play a very different role in the soil than soil microbes do, although they're very much a part of the decomposer community. As I indicated earlier, in the science of ecology, they're known as ecosystem regulators. Well, what are they regulating exactly? Well, they're regulating decomposition, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute, but I'm going to talk about the three primary groups of invertebrates: arthropods, nematodes, and earthworms. And again, these organisms occur with staggering diversity of organisms. Again, no one knows how many species there are, but I'm going to touch on that subject in a few minutes. But again, when you exclude in studies that exclude invertebrates from the soils, that those plants growing with invertebrates grow with much increased growth rates as a result of the presence of these organisms in the soil that is disproportionate to the relatively small amount of energy that they consume. Now, why is that? Why are they exerting this influence on the soil community that, in spite of the relatively low amount of energy? Well, they do that by regulating the activity of soil microbial organisms. When you introduce invertebrates into the system, microbial biomass increases as a result. Now, there are a number of different mechanisms whereby microbial decomposition is stimulated by the presence of invertebrate organisms. There's one group of invertebrates that are fragmenters and shredders. These organisms are breaking down dead organic matter, and although the assimilation efficiency may be relatively low, they're breaking down this dead organic matter into smaller and smaller fragments. And what they're doing in the process is exposing these organic matter fragments to a greater surface area. So that greater surface area allows for greater colonization and inoculation by soil microbes, greatly accelerating the decomposition process. There are other mechanisms known as well. They transport microbial spores. This came home very strongly to me. I worked with a mycologist at Oregon State University, and what he did while he was there is he took one individual insect, bark beetle, and he did a wash a surface wash of this insect and plated it on an agar plate. And he did that numerous times, 3 or 4 times, and just to see how many colonies he could grow as a result of the washes from this one individual insect. And it was astounding how many, literally hundreds of colonies formed on a result of these washes. So they have a tremendous capacity to transport microbial spores to new and decaying substrates. They're much more mobile than microbial organisms, so this is a very important mechanism whereby they increase the rate of decomposition and nutrient cycling. Some other interesting mechanisms are that another group of invertebrates are the grazers, the microbial grazers. They feed on bacteria and fungi, not necessarily on dead organic matter. And one of the important features of the soil food web is that microbes have the ability to outcompete plants for nutrients. So as long as nutrients are locked up in the biomass of microbial organisms, they are largely unavailable to plants for plant growth. By grazing on microbes, these invertebrates are releasing these nutrients for continued uptake by plants. Also, it's been found that grazing actually stimulates, a moderate amount of grazing of microbial biomass actually stimulates the microbial metabolism of microbial organisms, thereby accelerating decomposition rates as well. And I did some of that research as part of my master's thesis as well. There's some important symbiotic associations we're just going to touch upon today. They're also very important through their channeling and burrowing activities and their excretion of fragments of soil organic matter. They're building soil structure. Soil structure is the distribution of pore spaces and soil aggregates in the soil. This is very important to soil fertility. It allows for greater oxygen exchange in the soil, and it allows for the movement of water through the soil that carries important nutrients. So it's a very important process for the fertility of the soil. There are a number of plant pests as well, predators and parasites that are, in some cases, used in biological control organisms. Now, the first group is the nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic in and of themselves, even though they are more classified as invertebrates. Their relative size is about a millimeter, give or take. They don't possess the kind of enzymes necessary to break down dead organic matter. They're primarily bacteria and fungal feeders, and thereby are important in releasing key nutrients. They tend to concentrate around the soils of plants, around the root system of plants, rather. They do function as predators and parasites, and some of these parasites are used in some biological control as well. In some cases, they, in certain circumstances, the root feeders can be important plant pests. Some of the biological controls, you can literally buy nematodes off the shelf, and controls of crane flies, root weevils, and scarab beetles as well. The earthworms are an interesting group. And again, I talked about how soil communities can vary dramatically from one ecosystem to another. And this is really true of earthworms as well. One of the common ones are night crawlers and red wigglers, which are very common and earthworms used in composting of organic waste. Both these species are introduced from Europe. They're non-native species. Night crawlers can be particularly dominant decomposers in some ecosystems, particularly deciduous forests in eastern forests and Midwest, where they have the ability to decompose organic matter at very, very rapid rates. A lot of earthworms have microbial organisms in their intestines that allow them to decompose some of these more complex organic substrates as well. But these night crawlers in some of these ecosystems where they're dominant are known as ecosystem engineers because of the very profound effect they have on soils. They can burrow very deeply into the soils for several feet or several meters. And in the process, they're churning and mixing the soil and burrowing and creating a lot of soil structure. So they greatly enhance the fertility of soil where they're dominant. They are pH intolerant organisms. Why we don't see them in the Pacific Northwest. They don't survive very well in the low pH of conifer soils. There are many other earthworms that are that live and are native to the Pacific Northwest, for example, flatworms, but don't appear to be the kinds of dominant decomposers that they are in, for example, these other systems. Earthworms can be very dominant in tropical ecosystems as well. But our native earthworms, the egg-tetrayed worms, popworms, all these organisms are shredders and fragmenters of dead organic matter. Generally, I hadn't found these to be very abundant in the soil, and again, don't seem to be as dominant in terms of decomposition process as some other organisms, although in reviewing the literature, they're generally in the Pacific Northwest, a poorly studied group, so who knows what will emerge in future studies. Now, soil arthropods are a very dominant group of organisms in the soil. They occur in staggering numbers and staggering diversity. They perform the numerous functions in the soil that I talked about earlier in terms of grazing on microbes, fragmenting litter, and forming a number of symbiotic associations. Isopods and millipedes are important fragmenters that I'm sure many of you have commonly seen in forests in the Pacific Northwest. The Symphyla are smallish arthropods that are root-feeding arthropods that in some cases can become pest species as well. Spiders and centipedes are fast-moving predators in the soil. There are a number of parasitic wasps as well that feed on a number of different organisms. But in terms of sheer numbers and sheer diversity, nothing rivals insects. Insects by far are the most diverse group of animals of any other group, not only in the soils, but in the world as well. It's estimated that there may be in the neighborhood of maybe a little less than 1 million species that have been named and described by science, but some estimates put them between overall 5 and 10 million species. I've talked to some entomologists working in tropical ecosystems that think there's got to be closer to 30 million species in the world because they're just so diverse. But it kind of underscores how much yet we have to learn about the soil communities when so many organisms haven't even been named and described by science, let alone know what it is, what the heck it is they're doing in the soil, right? What are the processes are, what are their interactions with other organisms? So there's a lot we don't know. But one thing is key, very high diversity, just the staggering diversity of the organisms allowed them to radiate into a lot of microhabitats in the soil, performing a lot of the different functions that they are performing in the soil that is necessary for the productivity of the soil. Now, one group I have to talk to you about, and I have to admit a bias here because this is the group of organisms that I studied while I was doing research at the University of Washington. And this is this invisible diversity of arthropods, the microarthropods. This is a group that many people aren't even aware of that exist. And I wasn't aware of them until an entomologist at Oregon State University introduced me to this group. And it's a group that just blew my mind when I first discovered them. And these are the mites, the springtails, beetles in very small sizes of less than 1 millimeter in size. They were true flies, numerous parasitic wasps, of which we have no idea what they're parasitizing. And literally they occur in staggering numbers. They have occurred to up to 250 species. have been recorded in just a single square meter of soil, up to over 200,000 individuals within a square meter of individual soil. So just staggering numbers of these arthropods that occur in soils that many of us are not even aware of. I have to relay the story. I worked with a mentor who I worked with, an entomologist at Oregon State University named Andrew Mulvaney, and he wrote an article in the 90s called 120,000 Little Legs, which you can access on the internet today. But he actually, in this article, counted the number of invertebrates or number of arthropods you step on every time you take one step in the forest, and counted that with every step you take, you're stepping on 120,000 little legs. So just a very compelling story. So just some keys on what we could do to maintain healthy soil food webs. I could spend 40 minutes talking about this subject alone, but reading site and soil conditions in a particular soil that you're working with could go a long way in addressing any problems or maintaining healthy soils. Some of the conditions are fairly obvious, like standing water. Obviously, if you have standing water occurring at any time of the season, this is not a healthy condition for the soil community. They create anaerobic conditions that are toxic to most soil organisms. It may be a symptom of other problems that exist, a high water table or soil compaction, all very destructive to the soil community. You want to pay attention to the exposure, the cardinal direction of the exposure. Southerly exposure has very different properties than the northerly exposure. Obviously, southerly exposure can be much more prone to desiccation and drying out, and therefore erosion and leaching than a northern exposure. And also the slope, you want to pay attention to the slope. It doesn't necessarily take a very steep slope because of other conditions in the soil to create instability of the soil. So if you're seeing signs of erosion, surface erosion, bare minimal soil or movement, that wavy movement of downslope movement due to heavy rainfall, that's obviously not a good condition that you might want to address to some degree or other. Maybe looking at the surrounding trees may also be an indication. Their weak crowns or the chloritic or yellowing plants in the adjacent soils may be an indication of some problems in the soil. Maintaining living plant cover is another important aspect of maintaining healthy soils. Plant cover obviously ensures continued input of nutrients and energy to the soil community, maintaining the health of the soil. It also protects the soil from extremes in temperature and moisture, so it's moderating the soil microclimate, which could create extremes in temperature and moisture once removed that may be detrimental to the soil community. The root system itself helps stabilize the soils and to prevent erosion if that seems to be a problem. So you want to minimize disturbance. So tilling generally is not a good thing to the soil community. It exposes breaks a lot of those high flow networks in the soil. It makes it more prone to erosion and leaching of the soil. Obvious signs of compaction due to vehicle and pedestrian traffic also is a problem, as it destroys soil structure, and it may be a problem that need to be addressed. I'm running out of time here, so I have to kind of move along. But of course, maximizing plant diversity creates a diversity of inputs in the soil, creates a diversity of species in the soil that eventually results in increased plant growth and productivity as well. Oof. Somebody help. Okay. Now, just one final point on this. Any of these conditions can create stress on plants. And one of the first things to go when a plant is under stress is the immune system of the plant. So these conditions, once creating stress, make the plant much more vulnerable to insect attack and diseases. So that's another key point in trying to maintain the health of the soil. Oh, come on, please don't do this. Okay, so just in conclusion, just remember, the soil is alive with an incredibly diverse and complex community of organisms. And with every step, in the words of my colleague Andrew Muldanky, with every step you take in the forest, your foot is being supported on the backs of 16,000 invertebrates held up by 120,000 little legs. Not only that, 72 billion bacteria and 14,000 meters of fungal life. Just an incredible diversity of life in the soil. Thank you very much, everyone.